This is Michael Smith of MedPage Today. I'm in Vienna at the International AIDS Conference, where the meeting is just wrapping up after 5 days of very exciting research. We're taking a break. It's a busy day of late breakers, and we just thought we'd update you on what we see as the highlights of the meeting so far. I'm with my colleague, Ed Susman, and we've been in and out of sessions and talking to people all day, all week, and this is what we think. Ed, you've been at the AIDS meeting many, many times.
Yeah, since 1996, actually.
Well, can you ever remember a scientific session at an AIDS meeting where the audience gave the researchers a standing ovation?
That's very rare. You know, if I force myself to remember, I think there was an incident in 1996 when we first heard about the exciting possibilities of combination therapy for controlling HIV, which up to that time was just an uncontrollable disease. And I believe, I recall the researchers at that meeting, I believe Dr. Ho at the Air and Diamond in New York received a standing ovation. But that's really rare. These are very serious investigators. They like to hear 2 or 3 reports confirming something, and to get excited about the results of one study is one of the rarities of our reporting.
Well, as you know, because we've discussed it, that rarity occurred here. The researchers on one of the only microbicide trial to give a positive result so far were interrupted several times for spontaneous and prolonged applause. And finally, when they finished giving their results, the audience, several hundred strong, stood up and gave a standing ovation. Now that trial is important. Not because it's a home run. In fact, the efficacy is only about 39%, although it's higher if people are very adherent, and it gets up to above 50%. But it's the first time any microbicide has shown that it can prevent HIV infection in women. Why is that important? Well,
the real reason, and the reason everyone is excited about this, is because the HIV epidemic has transition to being a disease of women. More than 60% of women, of people with HIV are women. And one of the reasons women contract this disease, especially in resource-poor countries, in countries where cultures may be somewhat different than Western areas, is that women almost have no voice in such things as sexual relationships. And the microbicide gives them the chance to protect themselves. They don't really have to discuss it with their partner. They can just use the microbicide and be protected against this very bad disease, which disproportionately affects women, and especially women who are vulnerable. And that's why everyone was so excited about the success of microbicides, and also because so many microbicide studies in the past have been just awful failures. You know, we think in the Nightingale 9 study, which everybody thought was going to be the home run of home runs, it turned out to be a strikeout, and in fact was worse than, ended up being worse than the placebo. So to have a positive study on this is just one of those things that has lifted this whole conference to a higher level.
I think you're absolutely right, Ed. There are other issues, of course, that affect women and children. One of those is mother-to-child transmission, and we've been talking about this for a long time. Was there anything new at this meeting?
Well, this is a very frustrating, for me as a reporter, this is one of the more frustrating items. We've been writing about how to stop mother-to-child transmission since at least 1998 at the Geneva meeting, and which it was shown pretty positively that if you treat the women with highly active antiretroviral therapy, or the HART regimen, you prevent mother-to-child transmission. I mean, flat out, you just prevent it. And at this meeting, they're still discussing hundreds of thousands of infections in children around the world because this policy has not been implemented. And for me, it's just frustrating. I can imagine what it's like for those poor women out there who are still faced with the problem of having HIV-positive children.
And one of the studies discussed at this meeting showed that even in places that purport to, in Africa, and even in places that are supposed to be offering these services, only about 51% of mothers and children are actually getting the full protection. It is a frustrating
even more
thing.
Frustrating than that is that these same studies show that even partial adherence to these regimes are very, very successful in preventing the transmission, and yet there are some places that claim they have, they are providing these services to women, and when these researchers went and investigated their proportion of people who were getting treatment, the proportion was 0, which it's hard to imagine how difficult these things must be for other researchers who have spent so much time proving their point and not seeing results.
HIV is a tricky virus, as we all know. It requires a minimum of 3 drugs to keep it in check, and ever since 1996, or slightly thereafter, researchers have kind of not liked to talk about the notion of a cure. And that's, of course, because it's very difficult to get rid of the virus. It gets into what are called reservoirs or sanctuaries, and the drugs that we have don't affect that. This meeting is interesting to me in one respect, and that is that cure, if you will, has come out of the closet. There was a 2-day workshop before the meeting to talk about what sorts of things are needed, what sorts of information is needed. Unfortunately, what they found when in this workshop was that there's a whole bunch of things they don't know how the host interacts with the virus, they don't know how the virus interacts with the immune system, they don't know where these sanctuaries are or what cells are involved. But equally frustrating, I think, for the researchers who would like to pursue this end of therapy is that there's not really very much money available. The NIH has something like $1.5 billion for AIDS research in 2009, of which maybe 75 million went for research that could be attributed to cures. Ed, but we may sometime soon see information along those lines. One other thing, Ed, what else did you see that sort of struck your fancy?
I want to talk just a bit more on that cure issue, and basically in 1996 the word eradication came out of that meeting, and the joy over being able to control the disease for the first time. And then that joy was tempered and the talk of eradication disappeared because it became obvious that it was going to take 10, 15, 20, 25 years of treatment before you could actually get rid of those reservoirs, according to a number of models. And I think the reason cure is coming back into vogue is because now we know that we can keep patients on effective therapy for that length of time. So now maybe we can start looking at cures. One of the other things I wanted to mention were the new guidelines for treatment. There was a subtle change depending on how you look at these things, because they moved one of the treatments, the lopinavir, ritonavir heart therapy, which has been the mainstay of therapy for probably a decade, and they sort of demoted that in favor of a couple of other protease inhibitor regimens with darunavir and atazanavir boosted with ritonavir. And one of the reasons they did that, I think, is because exactly what we were saying just a moment ago, is that people are living longer, and the lopinavir combination had a tendency to show increases in lipid values, things that heart disease experts are concerned about, and these newer ones do not show that. So instead of just trying to control the virus, now we're looking at all the side effects that are involved in general health. HIV, we've said a number of times, has become a chronic disease, and like other chronic diseases, you get comorbidities with heart disease, renal disease, and diabetes and other things. And I think that's the underlying reason why they made those changes in the guidelines.
That is a subtle change, Ed, and not many of us would have noticed it, but I'm sure our audience would have noticed it, because they would have been paying close attention to the International AIDS Society USA guidelines released this week. Ed, there's more work to be done. We've got to get back at it. In Vienna, I'm Michael Smith with Ed Susman at the International AIDS Conference.